Goblins. Everybody loves goblins. But what are goblins? How do I know? And how can you meet them? There. So, my friends, welcome back. And today I'd like to talk about goblins. So, I had quite a strong encounter with goblins recently. I met the goblins, not the first time in my life. So I'd like to tell you about that experience and how you can replicate it if you wish at the end of the video. First, I'd like to talk about the role of goblins in folklore and mythology, a bit of taxonomy and naming and sort of definitions of what is and what isn't a goblin and some other creatures. Then I'd like to tell you a story about goblins that sort of exemplifies some of this from the folklore tradition. And then I'd like to tell you about my experience meeting of the goblins. So if you want to skip to that bit, I'll put a timestamp in the comments or something like that. Ah, you're still here. Good. Okay, so goblins. So goblins are interesting. I love goblins. But what I'm not going to talk about in this video, just to get this out the way, because there's some red herrings around here, is any kind of concept of a goblin in fantasy fiction or from the 20th or 21st century, or any role-playing games or tabletop games. You know, no Tolkien, no J.K. Rowling, no Dungeons and Dragons, no Warcraft, no Warhammer, none of that. Not to dismiss any of those things, they're all very fine. And also, I would argue, part of the ever-evolving folklore is just too complicated. Everything's just kind of gone exponential with sort of goblin mania, and it's easier just to look a bit further back in history when we're talking about goblins. Part of the problem with looking at any mythological or folkloric entity is that things don't remain constant over time. Things evolve, especially once we hit the kind of 19th century. Things change a lot. Usually things shrink in size, although goblins probably have always been small. I'll get to that. So that's one of the problems here. You know, things change in time. And also one of the other problems is we have in the island of Britain the influence of lots of different languages, you know, 5 or 6 at least, and all have their own different names for various entities or different similar entities. And once they enter the English language, they're kind of classified as different things, even though they might originally have been kind of similar. So that's a kind of another difficulty we need to be aware of. I think when we're looking at any of these mythological entities, we need to be a bit elastic with our definitions. You know, anyone who says, that's not a goblin because it's got hair or it's got wings, things are a bit more elastic than that. Having said that, I think there are some general things we can say about goblins, what they definitely are. First, though, where does the word come from? What does goblin mean? It's a loan word from the French. It entered the English language in the medieval period. Goblin, goblino, goblin, goblet. But it refers to a hollow or a hole in the ground. That's sort of the word origin, which tells us something, doesn't it? The Germanic word of a similar entity, a kobold. You might be familiar with a kobold if you're a fan of, I don't know, Dungeons and Dragons or something like that. But that also relates to a hole in the ground or a subterranean kind of entity. It's where we get the English word cove or cave from, kobold. So kobolds and goblins, pretty similar in my book. Another French loan word is fée or fairy. And often fairies, when a fairy is being described, it really seems a lot like a goblin. That's because at a certain point in history, fairy was used as a kind of catch-all term for any supernatural entity. But we're not talking about fairies today, maybe in another video. Other similar words or entities are pixies, Cornish pixies. Again, sometimes we think of in the modern era as these as being a bit more elf-like and benevolent, but originally I think a pixie would have been more like a sort of goblin. Also brownies from up in Scotland. Again, in Cornwall, we've got knockers. They're sort of subterranean entities that lead you to tin veins or maybe steal your tools, sensing a theme here. So that's from Celtic language loanwords, pixie particularly, probably a Celtic language loanword from the Cornish language. From Old English, we've also got elves. That's more of a fairy, I would say. And orcs. Another red herring here, orcs. We've slightly got Tolkien to thank for the kind of merging of orcs and goblins together, even though in his later work, orcs are kind of big and goblins are kind of small. Again, Tolkien didn't totally make that up. There's something to be said for that. In Old English, an elf is just an entity, a spiritual entity that might help you or do harm to you. And an orc is less ambivalent. It's more hostile, a demon of some sort that might give you a disease or just mess you up. Usually in Old English, though, I would think of them as being kind of human-sized, invisible entities, maybe like the djinn, rather than diminutive. So I don't want to get too carried away in taxonomy and different categories of different kind of things. Let's just talk about goblins here. That's what you're here for. You're here for goblins. Let's park orcs. Let's park fairies. Let's park nixies. Let's park pixies. Let's park sprites. Let's park brownies. Let's park hobgoblins. Although interestingly, with hobgoblins, the most famous hobgoblin in the English language is probably Puck from A Midsummer Night's Dream, who is a puka, another Celtic language loanword for a kind of goblin. He's called the hobgoblin, Robin Goodfellow. So is he a fairy? Is he a goblin? It's a bit confusing. But what can we say about goblins in the folklore? We can say a few things. Generally, they're diminutive. They're small entities. They're not human-sized. Sometimes they can become massive in stories, but that's generally a kind of magical projection rather than actually being giant-sized. They're generally small. They're generally mischievous. They're cheeky. They're up to no good. However, they are not evil. They're not wicked most of the time. They're not cruel. They're not necessarily good either. They're just sort of morally ambiguous. They're tricksy. They are. You might put them under the umbrella of the trickster archetype. They're tricksy entities. They might hide things around the house. They might misplace things. They might try and frighten you or get a rise out of you. More on this later, because this is definitely true in my experience. So they do that sort of thing. They're not necessarily green. I would say that's a later fantasy fiction thing, but they can be. They're probably quite grotesque. Unlike the fae or the fair folk or the gentry, which may also sometimes be diminutive. Again, that might be a later 19th century thing, but the fairy folk are generally quite beautiful to look at most of the time, not always. None of this is clear cut, but goblins definitely are grotesque. Yeah. So little, grotesque, mischievous, impish, imp, kind of another word for a goblin, morally ambivalent. Also subterranean, living in holes in the ground, also often associated with rot, with decay, with mushrooms, that kind of thing. Goblins. We all know what a goblin is. So I think that's my introduction to goblins in the sort of etymology and naming and taxonomy. Let me tell you a story about a goblin. Maybe more of a bogle or a boggart in this case. So many names for goblins. This one's from this book. This is the Hamish Hamilton Book of Goblins. Great book, this one. This story is called Yallery Brown, and it epitomizes many of the motifs of the goblin. So, one day, long ago, but not so very long ago, there was a young lad. Let's call him Tom. And he was somewhere between being a boy and being a man, just a young laddie was Tom. And this story's from up in Lincolnshire, so it's up there somewhere. And he just got his first job working for a farmer just down the road from his place where he lived with his mum and dad and all his brothers and sisters. So he would walk to this farm every day and he would milk the cows and he would clean out the stables and he would rub down the horses. And he enjoyed his job, It was good having a sense of pride with his work. It was hard work, mind. He had to be up at the crack of dawn and work all day, and then he would just go home and flop into bed. But the pay was good. So one day, Tom had done all his chores around the farm, and he finished early for once. It was rare. So instead of taking the short way home, which was just, along the country lane, he decided he would take a bit of a detour, a way he didn't normally go. He went down through the woods, crossed the stream, over the little hill and down there, past the other little woods, and then he was going to climb back up to where his mum and dad's house was. And he was just coming out of the woods on the other side, and it was starting to get dark, it was in the gloaming, and he suddenly heard a kind of dreadful wailing sound, like a baby crying. Help, help, help. He could make out the words. Help, won't someone help me? Maybe he was imagining it. Then it just sounded like a wailing baby again. And he thought maybe it was his, neighbour, Mrs. Biggins, who had left her baby out somewhere again. She was a bit careless. He'd left her kid somewhere. Surely someone couldn't have abandoned a baby by the side of the... Anyway, he started looking around to see where this sound was coming from, this wailing sound. And eventually he kind of located it, and it seemed to be coming from underneath a big, smooth stone, all covered in moss. He thought, surely it's not. No, definitely it's under here. And then, help, 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 help me, I'm under this stone. Well, it must be under there, he thought. But what was it? And without thinking, he just prized his fingers underneath that stone and pulled with all his might. It was a big stone, mind, but he was a strong lad, was young Tom. And he heaved and heaved and heaved, and finally that stone just rolled over. If you'd thought when he was doing it, clearly that stone, judging by the moss covering it, hasn't moved for many a year. Anyway, that old stone opened like a door, and there, in a hollow in the ground, was a little wizened thing. A hideous little... It was about the size of a baby, but all wrinkled, and its skin was brown. It was just made of wrinkles, and its skin brown like a nut with all these yellow blotches on it, and it had long hair like it was 100-year-old man. Long yellow straw-like hair from its beard coming out of its nostrils, pouring out of its ears, and coming out the top of its head and wrapping all the way around it. And its body was completely naked and wrinkly and kind of soft and saggy and covered in boils. But for all that, it was a very sprightly thing. And as soon as Tom had uncovered it, it hopped out of that hole in the ground and danced all around him, going, hee, and thanking him profusely. Oh, thank you, Master Tom. Thank you, Master Tom. Thank you, Master Tom. How does it know my name? He thought to himself. I know all about you, it said, as if reading his thoughts. And Tom became very afraid. He looked down at this thing's sparkling eyes that were black from lid to lid, and he grew very afeared. But the thing, only as high as his shin, seemed to read his thoughts again and said, there's no need to be afraid of me, Master Tom. I wonder if it's a sort of bogle, thought Tom. Nope, no bogle am I, although I won't tell you what I really am, said the thing. Tom was very afraid now, so a kind of odd formality descended upon him, and he took off his little cap and said, good to meet you, kind sir. May I inquire as to your name? And the thing said, oh, my name? Well, I suppose, Yallery Brown is as good a name as any. You can call me Yallery Brown. Yeah, I likes it. Okay then, Yallery Brown. Well, I might as well be on my way. Not so fast, young man. You've helped me more than you'll ever know. Now I want to do you a favour. What would you like? A wife? I can fetch you the sexiest wife in all the village. You might not have used the word sexy, some other word. A pocket full of gold? More gold than you can possibly carry? Maybe I can help you with your work. Now, Tom was thinking quickly. He didn't much fancy a wife. He was a bit too young. He had enough trouble with his sisters and mother and grandmother back home. And, he didn't really think the thing could really carry any gold. It didn't have any pockets. So he thought, well, I could always do with some help working on the farm. I hate working. It's hard work. And I would thank you. He was about to say, I would thank you very much. But the thing, reading his thoughts, stopped him and said, don't you ever thank me! And it suddenly became, from being very wizened and sweet, very, very cross, and it stamped its little foot on the ground. If you ever thank me, said Yallery Brown, I will help you no more, and you'll have trouble to pay. And Tom said, okay, I'm sorry. No, I won't thank you, but I would accept some work. Yes. And Yallery Brown said, very well, it shall be done. And then he picked up a dandelion puff and blew all the seeds in Tom's face, and Tom fell asleep. When Tom woke up, it was dark, and he was shivering. And he looked around him and thought he must have been dreaming. Yep, sure enough, the stone was back in its place. Just a dream. I'd been working too hard, he thought. And he hurried home, and his mum gave him such a scolding for dawdling. Next morning, he'd forgotten all about meeting this goblin, shall we call him, Yallery Brown. So Tom trotted off to work. But all his chores were already done. The horses were brushed, all the milk was there in pails under the cows, and the stables had been mucked out. Everything had been done for him, and all he had to do was sort of sit down and twiddle his thumbs. Well, this is brilliant, he thought. And this went on day after day after day, and, Tom was still getting his pay, but he didn't have to do any work. It was excellent. But, Tom started to notice something. He wasn't the only young lad working in that farm, and all the other young lads were starting to be very, very miserable about something. You see, all of Tom's chores were done, but all of the other lads, all their chores were mucked up. Whenever they brushed a horse, something would splatter mud all over it. Whenever they had milked a cow, the pail of milk had been upturned. It was spilled all over the ground. Whenever they cleaned out the stables, someone just dumped a whole load of manure in it. No one saw who had done it, but there were whisperings, and suspicion began to fall on Tom. And after a while, whenever Tom walked into a room or into a stable, all the other lads who had been talking amongst themselves suddenly went quiet. No one would talk to Tom. No one would even look at him. And Tom began to, be really quite miserable, actually. No one wanted to be his friend. He had had so much of this one day that he called Yallery Brown. He said, Yallery Brown, Yallery Brown, Yallery Brown. In an instant, the little thing was there at his knee. And he said, I'll thank you to help me no more. The thing went, what? You'll thank me? I told you not to thank me. I told you not to thank me. Well, look, I just don't want your help anymore. Thank you very much. Said the thing. Oh, I won't help you anymore, Master Tom. I won't help you anymore. But I never said I'd leave you alone. No, 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 no. From this day forth, you great big lump, you stupid head. From this day forth, nothing you do will ever go right again. Not your work, not your marriage, not your pleasure, nothing. And then he turned into a great big dandelion puff and floated away over the treetops, cackling and giggling, leaving Tom there shivering and shaking in his boots. Well, what Yallery Brown said was true. He never helped him with his chores again. And young Tom, he never had any luck in his life. He never had any luck in his marriage. He never had children. No crops could he ever grow. No hobby or work he ever set himself to ever met with any success whatsoever. His whole life was a miserable, miserable failure. All because of Yallery Brown. What does it say here? Work as you will, you'll never do well. Work as you might, you'll never gain out. For harm and mischief and Yallery Brown, you've let out yourself from under the stone. So don't go up turning mossy stones crying for help, lest you unleash a goblin. So in that story, again, we have a reference to a bogle, also brown, a brownie. That's a good hint as to what goblins sort of are in the folklore. They're sort of mischievous household spirits or nature spirits that will sometimes do things for you around the house, but you don't want to cross them. Otherwise, they could just as easily hinder you or ruin your life. So quite a large category of kind of household spirit there that needs to be placated. Probably a very, very old idea, predating the medieval period, predating this folktale, going right back into the pre-Christian period of troublesome or benevolent household or nature entities that need to be placated. That's sort of what, that's the umbrella of what goblins fit under in myth and folklore and pre-Christian religion anyway. But what are goblins really? So I've met goblins. I've had an encounter with goblin-like beings a few times in my life. If you've been waiting for this part of the video or skipped forward to it, I definitely don't mean in our physical reality, not flesh or blood goblins. And if you're the sort of person where your worldview, your paradigm is a physicalist and only this physical world exists, then this is probably might be a bit disappointing, this part. But I would urge you to maybe reconsider your viewpoint because, well, it's rubbish. So I've met goblins a few times. As a child, a lot of us, when we were children, I'm sure a lot of you have experienced this. When we're young, the veil is a bit thinner, isn't it? When I was younger, I was convinced I could see all sorts of entities. I knew the world was populated by kind of invisible spirits, and I was aware of goblins quite a lot. Sometimes in dreams, sometimes at the corner edges of my vision, sometimes just as a felt presence. But I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about in my adult life. The times in the past where I've encountered goblins quite a lot have been through magic mushrooms, specifically psilocybin semilancetta, liberty caps, also called elf caps or goblin caps in sort of local folklore of this area. Good clue there. We always see goblins and entities like that in the presence of mushrooms, don't we? So I've had lots of experiences with psilocybin containing mushrooms and encounter with goblin-like beings, not normally seeing them visually, but normally as a felt presence. And sometimes they've kind of come out of the earth or out of the dark regions behind my brain or out of outer space. And sometimes then they kind of are mushrooms. And kind of also aliens, but also goblins, and they're really, you can see them pulling faces at the back of your mind, in the caverns at the back of your mind, but they're more felt more than anything. But yeah, definitely experience of goblins are related to mushrooms, right? They almost are mushrooms. But that's not the experience I wanted to actually talk about today. The experience I want to talk about today was a more recent one with a very different type of entheogen or plant-based teacher. It wasn't a mushroom, it was an Amazonian brew that I'm sure many of you have heard of called ayahuasca. It's a jungle vine mixed with another plant compound containing a tryptamine, dimethyltryptamine, DMT. Highly visionary, highly visionary plant medicine. And I was not expecting to see goblins at this particular ceremony, but I should have known. In the ceremonial space, it was a very, very safe space led by some very experienced guides and shamans and space holders, and stuff for them kept going missing. And they kept making little looks at each other and looking at each other knowingly and saying, where's that thing? Oh, someone left this. Where's the thing I just put there? Someone moved it. And they kept saying, the pixies have moved it again. So it's clearly a thing that happened with this group or in this space. The word they used was pixie, which, again, generally in popular culture, I think of as more, rather than there. But there was that. So then there I was in the visionary space. This was probably the strongest ayahuasca experience I've had. Yeah, lots of visions. Unfolding, but what I really didn't expect to see so many of, and I've never seen on ayahuasca before, was goblins. So many goblins, and they were always they were never the main character. So at one point, I don't know, everything had opened up, and the spirit world was just reaching through with all its tendrils and tentacles, like great skeletal horse head dragon entities with kind of rot and eyes traipsing after them, like probing into my very soul and being, coming out of outer space. But here in the foreground, in a cave or in a kind of alcove, just here in the foreground, always, where there were little polyps of mushrooms, little pinheads, with all these mushrooms. And as soon as I saw them and focused on them, they all went, way! As if they were really excited that I could see them. And then they did a weird thing. They tried to frighten me, but in a really childish way, you know, like a 6-year-old. They literally did this. Lots of them. They would do things like this. And 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 it just made me laugh. And I said out loud, silly goblins. And I just kept saying silly goblins out loud because they just made me laugh, man. They're so funny. And I got this real sense from them that they were not malicious at all. Even though they looked grotesque, they were excited to see me and they wanted to get a rise out of me. And when I just giggled at them, they tried quite a lot harder to be scary. So one of them in the background, he had this head that got bigger and bigger, just like a puffball mushroom. It probably was a puffball mushroom, but set in it were several mouths, like maws with rows and rows of sharp needle-like teeth. You know, like a vast maggot or something like that, getting bigger and going. But I just giggled at that, and then his head popped into loads of spores, and like he fell off the ledge. And others of them were kind of trying to crawl over each other to get to where I could see them, so they could pull a face. But then one of them would kind of fall off, or one of them would pick its nose, and the other one would slap its hand. You know, they were just being they were chaotic, but they were pure goblin. And I just got the sense that they're always there. You know, they're not the main character of the experience. They're not Mama Ayahuasca doing her healing, but they're just there. They're on the margins. They're side characters. And I suddenly saw for the first time in, you know, high definition, what I'd seen so many times or felt so many times before in a mushroom experience. So that's just really interesting. I know this section of the video probably isn't going to be of interest to a lot of you folklorists or people just interested in myth out there, and it probably will be of interest to kind of psychonauts who might not have access to this channel based on algorithms. But there's just those are the goblins. That's what they are. They were kind of bald. They were kind of yellowy brown. Maybe some were green. Yeah, they had big noses and oversized ears. They were largely naked. They were small. They were silly. They were very, very silly. And, you know, I liked them. I was pleased to see them, and I can't wait to meet them again. So if you want to meet the goblins, your roots are, you know, one of those two substances I've mentioned. This is not an endorsement to take any, you know, dangerous substance. Check the legality in your area. You know, be aware of your own mental health. I guess as a closing note, anyone, I don't know why the algorithm would have brought you here, but anyone that says, well, surely that was just a hallucination. Yeah, I almost don't have patience for that argument anymore, just because it's only used by people that have never visited that space. It's a bit like someone trying to tell you all about a country they've never visited and they've just read about in a guidebook to someone who lives there. You know, it's a bit like Plato's cave, you know, it's a bit like the people chained to the wall looking at the shadows cast by the fire, trying to tell someone who's been outside and looked at the sun what reality is like. You know, they don't know. They've been trapped in a cave their whole lives. And that's what this reality is, probably. But there's many, many levels of reality. And that's where these beings live. And that's where the folklore comes from, in my opinion. Probably our ancestors in the way back have dreamt or tripped and had an encounter with these beings and brought them into the folklore that has then evolved. That's my opinion anyway. What do you think? Thank you very much, my friends. Thank you to the goblins. I'll see you again soon, my friends. I'll see you next time.